We have 7 Showa here in the vat to compare. This one is actually rather difficult because the level of these fish, being the best that we could find at the particular koi farm, is very, very similar. So there's not such a big difference between these fish. These fish are actually all siblings from the same spawning, so they carry very similar traits as a whole. Now, in regards to Showa, it is generally believed that what you need is a very good kahaku pattern, and if you were to remove the kahaku pattern, that you would then have a very good shiritsuri pattern. But I think Showa's not really quite like that. It's not so simple as that. You can get away with certain imbalances with the fish, whereby maybe the kahaku pattern lacks in one area, and it's made up for it by the sumi in that area to give it the balance that it really needs. I think it's quite often the case that if you have a Showa with a textbook kahaku pattern and perhaps a textbook shiritsuri pattern, what you'll often find is that maybe the pattern on the fish is so heavy that by the time it's overlaid with sumi, the sumi hasn't really got any interesting places or white ground to appear on. And it's incredibly important with Showa that the sumi quality can be admired in its full glory. And in order to do that, you've got to be able to see the sumi on the white ground. This is of paramount importance. I think it's fair to say that if you've got a Showa with the textbook kind of pattern, with the sumi that would be from a shiritsuri, you would end up with a fish that perhaps all of the white areas may become filled in by sumi. And then you've got no white areas left to actually enjoy and admire. So I think it is very good whereby you've got a pattern that maybe its lack of kahaku pattern does allow sumi to appear where that kahaku pattern should be, and therefore gives it the balance that you're looking for, and yet still allows you to have some white ground that you can admire on the fish. And this, I think, is where quirky patterns like this particular fish work so well. If you look at this fish, you can see that we've got essentially a kahaku pattern, sumi, and then more kahaku pattern at the back end. With patterns that have got a heavier kahaku pattern like this particular one, you can see that there's not really many areas for the sumi to come up. So if the sumi does come up, it will fall predominantly on top of the red. And the same with this biggest one in the vat as well. You can see here that if that sumi comes up, then a lot of it's on the red ground. And likewise, because of that, what you'll find is that the fish won't really have so many white areas left when the fish is big for you to be able to admire. So what you'll quite often find with Showa is that the sumi that falls on top of the red pattern will appear to be quite a black solid sumi, whereas the sumi that falls on the white ground will quite often appear to be like kage sumi. And when you've got that kind of sumi, what inevitably happens is that that sumi on the red pattern is using the colour as a base coat to make it look better than it really is, but the sumi that's on the white ground quite often will never actually materialise. It will always look like it's going to come, but it never will.
So let's jump straight in at the deep end. How, for example, with this fish, you can see a sort of kage effect to the sumi. You've obviously bought the fish with the future being all about the sumi. How are you hoping that it's going to develop? How do you know that it's going to come through?
Well, with this kind of fish, you've got really no assurance that it will actually come. It's more of a case of experience of the bloodline in general and the likelihood of that sumi to come up. You've got to look for some kind of indication somewhere on the fish to try and give you an idea of how good that sumi will be in the future and the likelihood of that sumi materialising. Sometimes you've got to talk to the breeder and try and get their assurance, because if you speak to them, they may well say, oh yeah, this is perfectly normal with this bloodline and this sumi will definitely come. So you need that kind of guidance for them. But also, as well as that, you need to look for somewhere where you've got essentially decent sumi coming from the root of the scales and surfacing properly as an indication of how good that sumi is. Where you'll often find this sumi is more often than not towards the back end of the fish and also deeper down the side of the fish towards the lateral line. So we'll take a closer look at this fish. It's still a gamble, but I would hope that in the future, in this case, it's going to happen. So what we're actually looking for here is root sumi, if you like, sumi at the base of the scale that's coming up.
When you say root sumi, you mean sumi right in the deep centre of the scale, which you hope would then creep out and fill the entire scale?
Yes, that's right. And if we look here as well, you can see also that we've got sumi starting on this scale. So hopefully the sumi will come up and it will be good. It's giving you some kind of glimmer of hope that in the future this fish will actually materialise. You got this part here, but it's not really giving you any real indication.
Yeah, see, to me that is almost doing the opposite, where the outside of the scale is black, but the inside is kind of a grey colour. Is that doing the same thing or doing something different?
It's kind of hard to say with that as to whether it's actually going to come or not. I would always try to look for some indication of good solid black sumi, and in these areas it shows some promise. And as you said, on this particular scale it's actually quite grey. So maybe instead of really coming up, this will come up more like kage sumi rather than high quality sumi.
Can you just explain what kage actually means?
Kage is really a word for a kind of incomplete sumi, which is effectively sort of on the edges of the scales and not really filled in properly. If you like, it's an excuse, I think, for low quality sumi. People in the UK, I think, often misread the Japanese word kage and think of it as being cage. They talk about cage sumi, and in a way I think this is the way of looking at kage sumi. It is almost like a cage, kind of like a honeycomb effect across the scales of the sumi, where it's actually incomplete throughout the scale. And you're kind of seeing it with this particular fish, in respect to the fact that the sumi on this one is actually a little bit incomplete across the scales. So kage sumi really would look a little bit like this, but will tend to be a little bit greyer in its appearance. Some people actually like the presence of kage sumi on fish, but for me, Showa is really about sumi, so it's not really something that I like. I regard it as just being inferior.
A lot of people seem to buy Showa because of the quick changes that can happen. You were talking earlier in the kahaku section about thinking about the fish's future and jumbo potential. So how does sumi tie in on these fish to the future?
That's a difficult one. For me, it's all about really sumi quality, but there's no point in having the sumi quality if the colour quality is no good. And likewise, if you've got a fish that's got high quality, but the body type is like a lot of those that you see, whereby they just get too fat and too kind of dumpy and female looking, then that's no good. You need a good body and you need good power to that body. With fish of this particular size, I tend to try and look for some indication of refinement of that sumi. That's most important to me. I like to see sumi that's in big consolidated blocks with nice sumi kiwa to it. And I like to see shiroji on the fish that's actually very clean and doesn't have any stray bits of sumi. And I really hate to see koromo sumi, that kind of dusty sumi that's just coming up on the surface. That's the worst thing in the world. It just ruins everything for me. If you've got sumi coming up that's got no sense of actually where it really is, so it's just scattered here, there and everywhere, I think it's just absolutely terrible. You're actually looking for the same kind of refinement within the sumi as you're looking for in the kahaku pattern, but in reality you're never really going to find this because Showa is such a busy kind of fish. There's so much going on. So there's always going to be a need to compromise on things. You've got to try and find something that you can live with and compromise with on Showa.
You don't seem to buy many Showa, Mike. Is there a particular reason for that?
Showa is nothing less than a nightmare. To try and find Showa with a good body type is very, very difficult. And to try and find Showa that have got really nice colour that will keep its terrier condition long term is also really difficult. The colour is very critical. It's got to be just right. If it's a little bit too soft, or maybe the sashay's too deep and uneven, that combination quite often works to produce secondary heat. And likewise, if the colour is a little bit too red, you can quite easily suffer terry damage. The colour just won't last.
Obviously you've got a lot of different stages of development in here. How does this link in? This is what's interesting to me. They're obviously all of a similar level, and it's trying to find the best fish for your money out of that bunch.
So with Showa, you've really got to take a chance a little bit with them and just hope for the best so that it comes good. So for all the fish really that perhaps turn out really nice as Showa, there's an equal number that perhaps you think are very good that just don't make the grade. By comparison, kahaku are actually so easy to get right. It's so easy to get something that grows up really nice and keeps a really good condition. Showa is really very, very challenging, and that's why I continue to buy some Showa. But it's also very, very easy to buy something that you think is going to be fantastic, and yet still it goes wrong. You see, looking at this particular fish, this one's actually the biggest of the bunch. The body looks really, really good and strong, but in reality, the colour quality, although it doesn't really look so much different, I think in the future will be a much lower quality of colour compared to the other ones. Whereas looking at this particular fish, it's kind of the opposite way around. You'll see that the colour quality is really beautiful. The style of the fish is actually very nice. The sumi looks very promising, and yet with this one, the body's actually the most inferior one of the whole bunch. This one, I think, is by comparison, would be a lot harder to grow big.
Yes, that one, to me, the body just seems a bit short.
Yes, it's a little bit short, and there's no real power to its frame.
Almost classic Showa, I guess, where you're going to end up with that big underbelly in the back end of the fish.
This kind of fish, I think, although it's maybe not so good for growing big, it's actually quite good for the koi show in smaller sizes. So really, this fish, I think, is the weakest out of all of those in the bowl on the whole, because to try and get this fish to be jumbo would be extremely hard. Whereas if you look on the other hand at this one, with its kind of quirky, if you like, imbalance pattern, I think this kind of body type is incredibly easy to get big. This should get huge in the future.
The belly is also quite flat on that one. Does that tie into the height of the fish and the backbone as well? Is that all part of the same package? Are they a reflection of each other?
In a way they are, because you don't really want a small fish that appears to have a good body, or a small fish that's carrying a lot of weight, because that kind of fish is very difficult to get big. So in the case of this smallest one out of the bunch, the body has actually got more weight on it now, which is an indication that it's not growing and therefore it's putting on weight. And also, it looks more feminine. The body line kind of pulls a little bit more up into the tail tube, so it looks more female. And in actual fact, that's kind of an inferior body type to the other fish. So the one with the quirky pattern, if you like, has got a very tight sort of body line. The body line underneath the fish is very tight, and it runs up into the tail tube, which has also got quite a lot of depth to it. So that kind of body is very, very easy, I think, to get jumbo. I think realistically with Showa and also Shiritsuru, you've actually got to be, if you like, hypercritical of the body type if you want something that you've got some realistic chance of growing to jumbo. Because really they are the most likely to develop that kind of fat, dumpy kind of look to the body shape.
You quite often see Showa with sort of short, pointy heads leading into really big bodies. Is there anything in here that might develop into an example of that?
Yes, that is an issue, and I think more often than not it is actually because the head is actually too small to start with. You'll quite often find that fish with that kind of head are actually a little bit short in the face, narrow in the mouth, and also tend to be quite shallow in the line underneath the cheeks. It is actually quite important, particularly with Showa, to understand where the bony and fleshy areas of the face are. And for that reason, we will actually put one of these fish back into the bowl so that we can talk about that. So if you imagine with this fish, the eyebrows of the fish above the eye is actually a very bony area of the head. And around the nostril area is also actually very bony, as well as the nose area. The gill covers are also solid bone. But the cheek area of the fish, in other words below the eyes, that area is actually very, very fleshy. So whilst this fish perhaps looks a little bit gaunt in the face, a little bit shallow and flat in the cheek area, what you'll actually find is whilst you grow this fish up, the body will put on weight, as you would expect, but also the face itself, in these fleshy areas like below the eyes, will actually fill out a lot more, which eventually will create a much more rounded head shape that's a lot more desirable. What is an issue, or can be an issue though, is that in the cheek of the fish, you'll find that the line underneath the cheek isn't actually deep enough. It's kind of shallow underneath the cheek. And what you'll find with that is that as the fish grows up, that area of the face won't actually put on weight in the same manner. So what you're looking for really is a cheek line underneath that perhaps runs from underneath the barbels down towards a gill cover, where it sweeps down in a rounded fashion, whereas if it goes, let's say, in a straight line from the barbels towards a gill cover, that's actually not so good. So if you buy fish or Showa with the wrong kind of head that maybe is shallow in the cheeks or just generally short in the head, what you will tend to find is that when you try to grow that fish, it will actually build up almost too much bulk on the body and too much bulk at the front of the body, which then leads to the head actually looking like it's too small. I think this Showa is actually a particularly good example as far as its head is concerned and its body type as well. If we look at this smaller one by comparison, you can see that the body type is actually a lot more feminine and a lot more delicate compared to the other one. The body actually is carrying more weight. It also appears to be shorter compared to the other fish, and the head also is shorter. I think it's much better to have a longer face of the fish and also a longer body if you want something to grow big. In this fish's case, the width of the head is almost the same as the length of the head, whereas really you actually would much rather have the fish be longer in the face than this one.
To me, this looks more like a rectangle or oblong kind of shape, whereas this one's more square.
It's kind of squared off and shorter and blunter. I think if we grew this fish through until, let's say, 50-55 centimetres, it would actually look very good. But I think that this particular fish would actually be very difficult to grow big, whereas this other one is a completely different animal altogether.
While we're talking about head and body and things, you often hear rules where the head should fit X amount of times into the body, for example. How does that apply, or is there any truth in it in your experience?
I don't tend to think about that too much. I just generally tend to look at the fish overall and get my own impression of the fish's head and body. I think sometimes that you can have a fish whereby the head looks particularly long and really broad in relation to the body, but in reality what that is that the body perhaps is too short and too stumpy for that kind of head. And likewise you can have a fish that can be very short in the head and very long in the body, which also is inferior. I think the bigger one in the bowl now, I think the body type and head type, that combination I think is ideal. It's pretty much perfect, whereas the smaller one, that body is shorter, it's fatter, and also the head is shorter.
While you're talking about tail tube, I want to pick up on this one. It's quite long. How does the depth of tail tube apply as well?
The depth of the tail tube is more in relation to the body line in general. If the tail tube or wrist of the fish, if you like, is shallower in its height, what you'll find is when the fish grows up, it will actually look a lot more delicate. The fish will look more female in its look. So looking at the bigger one here, that wrist is very, very deep and the body line is very tight. So with any luck, when this fish grows up, you'll end up with a fish that can put on a really good body and a really strong tail tube without looking too female.
So what you'll end up with is a fish with good volume from head to tail?
Yes, that's right, I agree. Now if we looking at colour quality, I think the one that we've just put back, I think that colour on that fish is actually very, very reliable and very safe for the future. Whereas these two fish now in the bowl, they don't look too different on the video, but in reality to me this kind of colour between these two fish is very, very different. The larger of the two fish here, although the colour may not look quite as good as the other fish, to me it's actually dramatically lower quality. Because you can see here that the colour is almost looking like it's got a slight terry issue. But aside from that, if you look then at the kiwa, most of the kiwa on this fish is actually quite soft and faint and blurred. And this really has to be regarded as a quality issue. The kiwa being this kind of kiwa in relation to that colour, I think it's going to be much more difficult for this fish to become good in the future. Whereas with this other one, you'll see that the kiwa is actually on the whole much better, and the colour is actually thicker and shinier than the larger fish. It's a lot better really than this one. But in reality with the larger one here, the kiwa is kind of a giveaway to the quality of it not being so good in the future. And that I think really concludes the selection of Showa. So now we're looking at Sanke, and in this case we're actually only looking at nisai because we don't have any examples of tosai to discuss on this DVD. Now as far as Sanke is concerned, The body type and colour, you're really looking at the same rules really as Kohaku. But in addition to that, you're then looking at sumi, and that's another topic all in its own. So first we'll look at the body, and these two fish are actually from two different breeders and two different body types. This first one, you can see that compared to the Kohaku we talked about earlier, this body type is very, very strong. The backbone is very strong and very thick, and carries that kind of hollowed out look that we had on the very good Kohakus. The head on this fish is also really good, and the way that it rises up over the back of the fish. And this fish, with this kind of head and body combination, is very, very easy to understand. It's very easy to understand how well it's going to grow, and very easy to predict that the fish will get jumbo. Body type really on this fish is very different. The fish has still got very nice height to the back of the fish, but she's carrying more weight and also looks a lot more feminine than the other one. The difference in these two body types is really because the first one has got a lot of Matsunosuke blood in. And Matsunosuke really was used a number of years ago to try and improve the size within Sanke. And then what's happened since then is that breeders have used their own pairings, if you like, of mixing other bloodlines back in to try and improve the refinement, to get away from that Magoi blood and produce fish with better bodies and better quality of colour and also better sumi. So this koi really doesn't have any Magoi blood, or very little Magoi blood. So the body type is really a lot more like an older style, if you like. There's more shape to the fish. The other one really, with that Matsunosuke blood, is a much longer and more powerful kind of body for getting big. Now the colour on this fish is very soft, it's very, very thick, and this kind of colour is very, very easy to raise well and very robust. Whereas the other fish, although the colour is also very, very attractive, it's actually a lot more delicate with this kind of colour, I think, to keep it in good condition for the future, and a lot more prone to terry damage. If you look at this fish a little bit closer, you can see that it already has a little bit of weakness to the terry. And if you look down around the side of the fish, where the fish is less exposed to light, you'll find that that would be reflected in the fish's colour pigment, if you like, not being so well replicated as it goes across the scales. So you'll find that sometimes there is some weakness further down on the size of the fish. So if you look here, you can see the tips of some of these scales are actually lacking in pigment. But if you were to look at the upper area of the fish, you can see that the terry on the rest of the fish is actually very good, which indicates really that this issue along the flanks of the fish is really more so light related. So hopefully in the future this will improve in this regard when the fish gets bigger. If however you were to have terry weakness or incomplete colour around this area on the top of the fish, then that would be a really big problem, because the fish is already exposed to a lot more light. That kind of colour damage is inherently almost impossible to fix up.
So as a keeper, is that something you should be looking to address in the way you're keeping and raising the fish? You mentioned perhaps that you've not got enough light into the pond. Is that something you can fix by changing the way you're raising the fish?
To some degree, yes. You'll often see with other fish like Kohaku and Showa as well, that if the pattern wraps very, very deeply down the sides of the fish, you'll sometimes find that the colour will kind of have weakness within the scales where it's very, very deep and lacks exposure to sunlight. If you look at this area here, you can see what appears to look like a terry weakness. You can see that this scale appears to be transparent or lacking in colour pigment cells. If this was in the middle of the pattern, this would be a big problem. In this particular case, maybe it's a break in the pattern, or maybe it's just a scale that is weak in pigment. But with Sanke, the good thing is that when fish like this become jumbo, some of these weaknesses, because of that presence of sumi, can make the whole thing a lot easier to overlook, because it's so much easier to appreciate the fish from that third dimension of sumi. If this was a Kohaku, because of the simplicity of such a fish, it would be very difficult to overlook this kind of weakness. But I think with this particular fish, the pattern is very busy, there's a lot going on. And the sumi that's present, I think, would make it very easy to distract you from the one or two weaknesses that this fish will have when it grows up. Where the bloodline differs between these two fish the greatest really is in the sumi type. The sumi between these two fish is very, very different. Now this particular one has a lot of Matsunosuke blood, and therefore its appearance of sumi is much different to the other one. The sumi on this fish is actually very good quality, but the way it develops is very different to the older lineages of Sanke. This will tend to start as almost like scratches or flecks of sumi within the scale, and what will happen then is that as a fish grows, you develop more and more of that until it slowly starts to consolidate and become more solid blocks of sumi. And you can see that the sumi in this area is still very much incomplete and is still filling in this area.
In here?
Yes, and what you'll see is that later on this sumi will slowly fill in more and more, and then eventually when the fish is bigger it will start to develop more shine to the sumi. So with this kind of sumi, as the fish gets bigger, what you'll find is it will consolidate and develop more into bigger blocks of sumi throughout the fish. But in the case of this area, what you'll see is when the fish gets bigger, it will then develop more shine when it gets jumbo, and then you'll see that it will start to develop sashi to the sumi, which is already starting now, which gives you some kind of indication as to the quality of the sumi. Typically, Sanke of this bloodline have got a tendency to throw sumi where you don't really expect it to. So with this particular fish, it would pay to buy such an animal with less sumi on when it was small, and then just kind of hope that the sumi will come up in decent places later on. If you buy a fish with a lot of sumi when it's small, what will quite often happen is it will become overrun with too much sumi later on that lacks refinement and is too scattered throughout the fish. So I think in that regard this fish is actually a very safe bet for the future. I don't think that with the finish of the sumi or sumi sashi at the tail end of the fish, I don't think it will become overrun in the future.
This fish kind of breaks the rules that we were talking about when we looked at the Showa tosai earlier, in the fact that a lot of the sumi, certainly at the front end of the fish, falls on the red. I guess that's the point you're about to make.
And it's fair to say that a lot of people have looked at this particular fish and commented upon the quality of sumi in this area. But it really needs to be forgotten about, because this sumi is actually falling on top of colour. And in that case what actually happens is the sumi looks better than it really is, because it uses that colour almost like an undercoat or primer, which makes the sumi look blacker and shinier than it really is. So with fish like this, you really need to look to the white areas like the sort of back end of the fish to try and actually get an idea of how good the sumi is. And in this case I think this sumi will become very good in the future. This Sanke is completely different sumi to the other one, and this is because of really the predominance of Sadazo bloodline within this fish, which gives you a completely different look to its sumi. This sumi, as you can see, even despite the young age, already has good sashi to it and good shine to it. And the way that this sumi develops is a lot more of the kind that we're familiar with from the older days, if you like, whereby sumi will start underlying and will slowly work its way to the surface and start to fill in where you can expect it to, or where you would normally expect it to.
Kind of more predictable sumi?
It's more predictable. You can see where it's underlying, you can see where it's going to come up. But what you can see with this fish is extremely high quality sumi that's already got a lot of shine to it. So if you look at this one, you'll see that the sumi really now for the koisho is not so good. There's not really any good finish to the sumi. But I think in the future as a jumbo fish, the finish on the sumi will be very good. Whereas the one with the Sadazo sumi, it's very easy and very clear to understand and see the quality of that sumi, even despite the fish's young age. One thing to think about with sumi on Sanke is that different bloodlines will develop at different speeds, and this starts from a very early stage like as fry. And in this respect, a lot of fry, or generally all Sanke fry really, when they're let's say 2, 3, 4 centimeters long, will tend to have so much sumi that it's very hard to see the kahaku pattern underneath. And then what actually happens is different bloodlines of Sanke fry will develop at different speeds. So what will happen from that point on is that as the fish grows and gets older through to tosai in the autumn, the sumi will work its way down. Whereas what will happen is that perhaps with like the Matsunoski lineage Sanke here, in the autumn the Sanke will be already particularly very much down, and then through to Nisai will be slowly coming back. What you'll actually find is other Sanke bloodlines will develop in such a way that the sumi is actually, as tosai, it's still going down. So then maybe as nisai, the fish has actually got less sumi instead of more sumi. And then maybe as sanzai onwards, the sumi starts coming back again. So it does pay really to try and understand some of the lineage behind the Sanke sumi that you're looking at. So looking at this fish, I think if you saw this fish as young fry during the selection process, you'd see sumi going all the way down the back. So much so that it would actually be very hard to make out where the kahaku pattern was on this fish. And then whilst this fish has been in the mud pond as fry, what's happened is the sumi has then gone down further. And then in the autumn, what you then got is the sumi that we've come to sort of know and understand a little bit more, whereby it's underlying sumi that you're looking to see where it's going to come up. I think both of these Sanke are actually very good. This one does have one or two refinement issues and weaknesses perhaps in the terry, but I think the overall style of the fish and the sumi quality of the fish make it very, very forgiving, and I think a very good prospect for the future. The other fish, on the other hand, this one is a lot simpler to look at, and I think very, very predictable. Not so exciting for the future, but very, very safe, if you like, on its body type and qualities. Very easy to get big and very easy to keep its quality as a big fish. One thing we brushed over earlier with kahaku is the blue eye, if you like. And you can see both these Sankes have got blue eyes in the same manner as the kahakus have. But what you'll also see if you look closely at these fish is the flecks of sumi that we spoke about within the iris of the eye, which is something that you will quite often see within Sanke. This one also, as you can see, has got a lot of sumi within the iris, but the eyeball is still kind of blue like the other fish, and also like the kahakus earlier.
Mike, can you tell me a little bit more about these fish? Are they fish you bought in as nisai, or have they been grown on here?
Yes, both of these fish actually are fish that arrived last year as tosai. And this one arrived at 35 centimetres in spring of last year, and the other one I think arrived a little bit bigger. I think it was about 38 centimetres. And now this fish is 63 cm, the other one I think is 61 centimetres. Although these fish are now nisai, I think one thing that's quite relevant is that these fish were actually brought in as tosai. And since we're talking about selecting tosai, I think this is perhaps evidence that fish can be grown relatively quickly from tosai to nisai, and can also be predicted as becoming good fish for the future. I think if you're raising fish from tosai to nisai, you need to have some kind of idea what kind of goal you've got for raising those fish as nisai. So if you buy fish like these at perhaps 35 centimetres and as nisai you've raised them to 40 cm, that's not really so good. The fish is never really going to grow jumbo. So when you're growing fish, you need to think about what size the fish would be in the hands of the breeder if they continue to raise it. And you need to at least match the kind of sizes that they would grow to in the breeder's hands. So if the breeder is going to raise them to say 60 cm, then obviously the fish when you've raised them yourself also need to be 60 cm or more.
Do breeders have those kind of expectations as well?
They will. To be quite honest, I think most breeders will look at tosai and they think, oh yes, this one's going to get big and the quality's good, so I'll keep it. Whereas another fish, it might be very attractive, but if the breeder thinks that it's not going to grow big or grow very quickly, they'll just sell it out as tatestra instead. What a breeder will find is that the bigger the fish is as tosai, the easier it is to predict its future. So if you've got two fish perhaps of 40 centimetres each, they may be the same size, that the breeder will find it quite easy to look at one fish and say, well, okay, I think this one's going to grow to maybe 90 cm, whereas the other one they might look at and think, well, the body type's not so good, maybe this one will only do 80. So that's it now really with these two Sanke, but now we're going to go to a different fish house to go and find two other examples to talk about. So looking at these two other Sanke, these are actually siblings from the same breeding, the same age, same parents. and you can see the fish are very, very different to look at. If you look at these two fish, the build of the body structure of the fish is very, very different between the two, and also one of them has got a much broader and longer head than the other one. And one thing I've often heard people say is that they think that all offspring from a certain breeding will eventually attain the same size, but I can assure you that in the case of fish such as these two, one of these I think is very, very easy to grow beyond 90 centimetres, whereas the other one perhaps 80 centimetres. And the reason for that will be that one fish had a different body type and bone structure to the other fish, and that is the reason that the fish has actually grown to a different size. Looking at this fish, we can see that the body type is very long and very strong on its backbone, and the head also is very broad and long. The backbone is very, very thick, and I think it's easy to say that this kind of fish will get very, very big in the future. I think it's very easy with my understanding of this bloodline to say that this particular fish will be very easy to grow beyond 90 centimetres. But if we take a look at the other fish here, you will see that it's a very different body type. You'll see the backbone of the fish is weaker, the body type is a lot more feminine looking, and also the head is a little bit shorter and also narrower. The backbone of this fish has got less height to it, and the body line has got a little bit more shape to it. This kind of body really is better for taking to the koi show in smaller sizes, but not so good for getting big. These fish have got very similar kind of colour types, and also kiwa and sashi are very similar and very consistent, very high quality. But one thing you'll see with this particular Sanke is that the sumi quality, despite its young age, has already got extremely high quality finish to it and very glossy. So I think and hope that the fish with this kind of sumi and this quality, and the fact that it's also starting to show some sumi sashi, will be such that as it grows up it won't develop too much sumi, and really it doesn't need to. I think this fish is very, very easy to understand for the future. The smaller Sanke, on the other hand, has smaller sumi that's also a little bit more scattered, with less shine to it and less sashi. And I think this kind of sumi in the future, the fish will develop a lot more sumi than a larger one, and has a possible risk of perhaps getting too much sumi in the future.
I think this is a really good example of what we've been talking about today, how the main key ingredient for growing fish to jumbo, which is your passion, body is king.
Body is key indeed. Body is incredibly important for a fish that's going to grow jumbo, but also the head shape is also important if you want something that's going to get big. After the body and head, really, the quality of the fish becomes very important, because there's no point in having a fish with a fantastic body that can get really big if the quality is no good. You need something that will become big and be high quality. The problem really is with this kind of fish that it's got the body type that you want, it's got the head that you want, and the quality of the colour is very, very good, and the sumi also. And at the end of the day, what will happen is with this kind of fish is, because all of those attributes are so good, the fish will become an awful lot more money than the other fish. If you start to compromise on the fish's body type, or the quality of the fish, or perhaps on the pattern style of the fish, then this will drastically reduce the price of the fish that you're looking to buy. And I think that in the case of Sanke and also the kahaka that we looked at earlier, that if you need to take any kind of compromise on the fish to try and make it affordable, I think you really need to compromise on the pattern, not the quality or the body type. The pattern is the easiest thing to reduce the price of the fish, and therefore you can still buy a fish that you can maybe grow up big and admire because of its technical merits rather than pattern.
Yeah, that all makes sense to me. One more thing I want to pick up on, we've not talked about it all day, is how some people see the difference in colour between red on the head and red on the body. Can you explain a bit about why that is and its relevance?
Yeah, this is a strange one. People often look at the head of a fish and compare the colour on the head to the colour on the body, and ask the question as to whether the colour on the body will eventually end up being as red as the head. But the nature of how this colour develops and how it appears is actually very different between the two areas. The reason for this is that on the head of the fish, the pigment cells actually tend to be deeper rooted into the skin of the head, and therefore result in the colour being darker. And as well as that, the colour that's on the scales of the fish is a little bit thinner, but also the scales themselves are more reflective in their nature, which means that the light penetrates through the colour and hits the scale, which then kind of reflects back and makes the colour look brighter. than the colour on the head of the fish. Whereas on the head, that light kind of penetrates into the skin a little bit and is just kind of lost. It doesn't reflect back in the same manner. Sometimes you'll find that if a fish perhaps gets damaged and jumps and takes some colour off on the head, the colour will get scratched off very, very easily without actually seemingly touching the skin. Whereas other fish, the colour will be deeper rooted, and if you scratch it, you'll see that the colour will come off, but you can still see colour pigments within the scratch itself because the colour is much more deeply rooted there. So it doesn't really matter with either of these fish. When they grow up, you'll actually find that the head of the fish will always appear to be a darker colour than the body of the fish because of that kind of translucent effect of the skin on the head. So as a jumbo fish, you'll find that it will also still be darker within the head area. Well, that pretty much wraps everything up for today, and I hope you've enjoyed watching this movie. We certainly had great fun making it.